What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's Ryan here on Max Afterburner. I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, former Air Force Thunderbird pilot, and I've flown airliners for years, the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. So I've got a background in fighter operations, strike packages, and how modern militaries actually plan and execute these things. And that background is exactly why I wanted to sit down and do a deep breakdown of what's happening right now with Iran, because there is so much noise out there right now, so much stuff flying around online that's either exaggerated, taken out of context, or flat out unconfirmed. And my job on this channel has always been to cut through that. I don't want to give you hype. I don't want to give you fear. I want to give you what is actually verified, what is still a claim from one side or the other, and then I'll give you my own read on it as a guy who has actually planned and flown strike missions. So let's get into it. First, a little bit of context, because if you're just now tuning into this conflict, you need the timeline to make sense of everything that's happening this week. This war between the United States and Iran didn't start yesterday. It goes back to the end of February of this year, when US and Israeli airstrikes hit Iran hard. And by most reporting, that opening wave took out a significant portion of Iran's senior military leadership and did serious damage to its military infrastructure. That set off months of on and off fighting, strikes, counterstrikes, attacks on shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and eventually, in the middle of June, both sides signed a memorandum of understanding, basically a ceasefire framework, that was supposed to end hostilities on all fronts, get the Strait of Hormuz reopened, lift a U.S. naval blockade over a set period of time, and lay out a path toward a more permanent deal, including things like reconstruction funding and a wind down of Iran's contested nuclear material. That was signed in mid-June, and for a few weeks, it more or less held. But it did not hold for long, and that's really what we need to talk about today, because the last week has been about as intense as anything we've seen since the February strikes. So let's walk through it, night by night, based on what's actually been reported by outlets on the ground, and confirmed by officials, not just what's floating around social media. Before we get into the day-by-day breakdown, I do want to give you a bit more on what that Memorandum of Understanding actually promised, because it helps you understand just how far things have fallen from where they were supposed to be heading. According to reporting on the full text of that agreement, it called for the immediate and permanent end of operations on every front tied to this conflict, and that includes Lebanon, not just Iran directly. It called for the U.S. naval blockade to be lifted within 30 days, for toll-free passage through the Strait of Hormuz to be guaranteed for 60 days, while demining operations were completed within the first 30, for at least $300 billion in reconstruction funding to flow into Iran on a set schedule, for sanctions to be phased out over time, and for a downblending of Iran's enriched nuclear material as part of the broader nuclear piece of the deal. That's a genuinely comprehensive framework, the kind of agreement that takes months of very careful diplomacy to put together. And within about 3 weeks of it taking effect, it was already unraveling. I think that's worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you just how fragile the underlying trust between these two sides still is, even after a formal signed agreement. It's also worth noting that this fight was never contained to just the US and Iran directly. Around the same period this ceasefire was falling apart, Israeli aircraft struck Beirut's southern Dahieh suburb in Lebanon, an area with a heavy Hezbollah presence, and Lebanese state media reported casualties from that strike. Lebanon's president has tied his country's willingness to keep talking with Israel to a broader Israeli withdrawal from parts of southern Lebanon. So you've really got two connected fronts here, the direct US-Iran fight centered on the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, and a parallel Israel-Lebanon front that keeps getting pulled into the same broader regional standoff. Any honest breakdown of this conflict has to acknowledge that it's not a clean single-front war. It's a web of overlapping conflicts that all feed into and off of each other. Around July 8th and 9th, the ceasefire effectively started to crumble. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, launched ballistic missiles at a U.S. base in Jordan. Jordan's government confirmed that it intercepted several of those missiles in its own airspace, and sirens went off across the country. Around the same time, explosions were reported in the Iranian cities of Konarak and Bushehr. Iranian officials told state media that a military facility near Bushehr had been hit by what they called enemy projectiles, and, separately, a naval zone near Konarak was also hit. Now here's where I want to slow down and point something out, because this is exactly the kind of detail that matters if we're being careful with the facts. A U.S. official told reporters at the time that the U.S. military was not conducting strikes in that specific window, and Israeli officials said they weren't aware of any Israeli involvement either. So you had Iranian state media attributing damage to U.S. and Israeli strikes, while U.S. officials were saying that particular round wasn't them. That's a real gap in the reporting, and I want to be upfront with you about it instead of just picking a side and running with it. It's possible that reporting was delayed, It's possible other actors were involved, or it's possible the Iranian description of the damage was inaccurate. We don't have full clarity on that one specific incident, and I'd rather tell you that than pretend I know something I don't. What is clear is that from that point forward, both sides escalated fast. U.S. Central Command, which is the combatant command responsible for military operations across the Middle East, confirmed it struck around 90 military targets along Iran's coastline late on a Wednesday in that same window, hitting things like missile and drone storage sites and logistics targets. Iran's response came within about a day. The IRGC said it hit facilities linked to the U.S. military in Kuwait and Bahrain, specifically naming bases at Arafjan and Ali al-Salam in Kuwait, and Jufair and Sheikh Issa in Bahrain, and it also said it struck a base in Jordan. Kuwait's Ministry of Defense confirmed at least one person was hurt in those attacks. Qatar briefly raised its security threat level and then lowered it again a short time later. And Jordan said it intercepted 8 incoming Iranian missiles that had been fired at a base in the country's east. Then things got even bigger. On July 11th and into the 12th, CENTCOM carried out what by that point was its third round of strikes in about a week, hitting roughly 140 military targets in a single night, which brought the total across 3 nights of operations to more than 300 targets struck. According to CENTCOM's own description, those targets included Iranian missile and drone launch sites, naval assets, ammunition storage, communication networks, and coastal surveillance positions. Iranian state broadcasters reported strikes hitting cities in the western Loristan province and a military base in a place called Kondab, along with strikes across 5 towns in Bushehr province on Iran's southern coast, including the city of Bushehr itself. Iranian officials said they were still assessing casualties and damage from that round. The reason the U.S. ramped up that hard is tied to what happened in the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC had attacked a Cyprus-flagged container ship, the GFS Galaxy, setting it on fire, with one of its Indian crew members reported missing, and Iran claimed it also struck and disabled a second vessel. Following that, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed until further notice. And if you don't know why that matters, I'll explain it in a minute, because that single stretch of water might be the most important choke point in the entire global economy, and closing it is about as serious an escalation as you can get short of a direct strike on a capital city. Iran's response to that third round of U.S. strikes was its widest single volley of the entire renewed conflict. In one night, Iran fired missiles and drones at 6 different countries at once. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, and Jordan all reported attacks. The IRGC claimed it had hit a U.S. radar site in Kuwait and destroyed a command and control center along with drone hangars at a base in Jordan, though Jordanian authorities said the 3 missiles that reached their territory fell without causing casualties. Oman's government said it summoned Iran's ambassador to formally protest drone strikes in 2 of its provinces. In the UAE, the country's air defense system engaged incoming missiles and drones, and officials later said the threats were kept outside the country's borders. Bahrain's missile alert sirens went off for a 3rd time since the fighting resumed, and Kuwait's military confirmed it intercepted incoming fire, while also confirming that 3 of its border posts and an offshore oil platform had taken damage, with 1 worker wounded. In Qatar specifically, 3 people were hurt by falling shrapnel. So across that single night, you had 6 different countries dealing with incoming fire, several confirmed interceptions, some confirmed damage, and thankfully what appears to be a relatively low number of injuries given the scale of that barrage. No fatalities were confirmed to me in the reporting from that specific night, and I want to be careful to say that rather than assume one way or the other. The next night, on July 12th into the 13th, CENTCOM carried out a 4th round of strikes in that same week, described as hitting dozens of targets across multiple locations. And here's a detail that stood out to me from a pure operations and tactics standpoint. That round marked the first reported use of one-way attack sea drones by U.S. forces in this conflict, used alongside aerial drones, manned fighter aircraft, and naval vessels. That's a meaningful shift in how the strikes were being carried out, and it tells you the U.S. was diversifying the tools it used to hit targets along the coast and in and around the strait. Iran's retaliation that night again hit Oman, Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait, with Iran claiming destroyed radar systems in Oman, hits on air bases in Bahrain and Jordan, and a strike on a missile base in Kuwait. Jordan said it intercepted 4 incoming missiles that night. And this is the part that I think deserves real attention and real respect. Because in this round, unlike some of the earlier ones, there was a confirmed civilian death. A projectile struck a water pumping station in the city of Mashhad in Iran's Khuzestan province, killing 1 civilian and wounding 4 others as part of strikes reported across at least 8 locations in that province. I want to pause on that because it's easy in a video like this to get caught up in the numbers, the targets, the hardware, and lose sight of the fact that there are real people on every side of this whose lives are directly at risk every single night this continues. So my thoughts go out to that family and to anyone caught in the middle of this on the ground, whether they're in Iran or in any of these Gulf states that keep getting pulled into the crossfire. Around this same stretch on July 13th, U.S. strikes resumed again at President Trump's direction, according to CENTCOM. And the U.S. official targeting description included Iranian coastal surveillance systems and drone and missile capabilities. Iran's military said it had struck and disabled 2 vessels it called rogue supertankers. Separately, the United Arab Emirates said Iranian missiles hit 2 of its tankers in Omani territorial waters, and 1 crew member was killed in that incident specifically. Because of the closure and the ongoing tanker attacks, the U.S. said it would resume a naval blockade on shipping to and from Iranian ports. Oil markets reacted immediately and sharply. Brent crude, which is the global benchmark for oil pricing, jumped by more than 9.5% in a single day, settling around $83 a barrel, which was its biggest one-day percentage gain in over 6 years. The American benchmark, WTI, jumped a similar amount. Now, both of those prices are still well below the peaks the market saw earlier in this war, when Brent went above $110 a barrel. But the jump shows you just how sensitive global energy markets are to anything happening near that strait. President Trump said publicly that the U.S. was planning additional strikes and that operations would continue at a heavy pace. And he's been quoted describing the U.S. response as proportionally much larger than whatever Iran does, framing it essentially as a 20-to-1 type of retaliation ratio in his own words. On the Iranian side, senior officials, including the Speaker of Iran's parliament, who has also served as a lead negotiator, said publicly that Iran would not be intimidated by American pressure and warned that further strikes would be met with further retaliation. There's also a political dimension to all of this that I think matters for understanding why things have gotten so unstable. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had led the country for decades, died as a result of the February strikes, and his funeral and burial took place just this past week in the city of Mashhad, drawing large crowds of mourners loyal to the government. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, has since been named the new supreme leader, and in an interesting and honestly pretty telling detail, he did not make any public appearance at his own father's funeral. And experts who study the region have suggested that's likely due to serious security concerns, given how badly Iran's intelligence and security apparatus was exposed during this war. He has since put out his first public statement since taking on the role, vowing to continue standing firm against outside pressure. So you have a brand new, largely untested leader stepping into this role in the middle of the most intense military exchange in the country's recent history, and that adds a layer of unpredictability to how Iran responds going forward, because we genuinely don't have a long track record with this specific leader yet to know exactly how he'll make decisions under pressure. Now let's talk about the mechanics of what's actually happening here, because I think this is where my background is actually useful to you, beyond just reading you a timeline. When you hear that CENTCOM struck 140 targets in a single night, that's not one aircraft dropping bombs. That's a coordinated strike package, and depending on the target set, that likely includes a mix of stealth and non-stealth fighter aircraft, long-range bombers, cruise missiles launched from ships or submarines offshore, and increasingly, as we saw with this most recent round, one-way attack drones, which are essentially uncrewed aircraft that fly to a target and detonate on impact, similar in concept to a missile, but often slower, cheaper, and used in larger numbers to overwhelm air defenses or to hit lower priority targets without risking a piloted aircraft. Using sea-based versions of those drones for the first time in this conflict tells me the U.S. is trying to hit targets along the coastline and near the strait without exposing manned aircraft to some of the denser air defense zones close to Iranian shores. On the other side, when Iran fires ballistic missiles at a base in Jordan or at Gulf states, and you hear that a country intercepted 8 out of some number fired, that interception is being done by systems like the Patriot missile defense system, which the U.S. has stationed with several of its Gulf partners. Patriot works by using radar to detect an incoming ballistic missile, then launching its own interceptor missile to physically destroy that incoming threat before it reaches the ground, ideally hitting it in the terminal phase of flight, meaning the last stretch as it's coming down toward its target. It's not a perfect system. No missile defense system in the world has ever been 100%, and that's part of why you see mixed results. Some missiles intercepted, some falling and causing damage, like we saw with the strike on that water pumping station in Khuzestan, or the damage at Kuwait's offshore oil platform. When Iran talks about hitting radar sites or command and control centers, they're specifically going after the eyes and communication links that make coordinated air defense and coordinated strikes possible in the first place, which is a pretty standard piece of military doctrine on both sides of any conflict like this. You try to blind and disconnect the other side before you go after everything else. I also want to touch on why you're seeing this play out so heavily around naval and coastal targets specifically. Things like ports, ammunition depots along the coastline, offshore platforms, and surveillance sites. In a fight centered on control of a maritime choke point like Hormuz, whoever controls the coastal radar and surveillance picture controls the ability to actually threaten shipping in a meaningful way. That's why you've seen repeated strikes on coastal surveillance locations specifically named in CENTCOM's own target descriptions. It's not just about damaging Iran's ability to strike back, it's about degrading Iran's ability to even see what's moving through the strait in the first place, which is a prerequisite for being able to threaten it with mines, fast attack boats, or anti-ship missiles. And for a little historical grounding here, this isn't the first time the Strait of Hormuz has become the center of a shooting war. Back in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, there was a period that came to be known as the Tanker War, where both Iran and Iraq attacked commercial oil tankers passing through the Gulf, which eventually led the U.S. Navy to start escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the strait to protect them. That period saw direct naval engagements between U.S. and Iranian forces, and it remains one of the largest sustained naval campaigns since World War II. I bring that up because it shows this is a choke point with a long, well-documented history of becoming a flashpoint whenever tensions in the region spike, and it's exactly why the U.S. maintains such a heavy, permanent naval presence there today, centered around the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, which is headquartered in Bahrain, specifically because of its position relative to that strait. And then there's the Strait of Hormuz itself, which I mentioned earlier and want to actually explain because I think a lot of people hear that phrase on the news without really grasping why it's such a big deal. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman that connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. At its narrowest point, it's only about 21 nautical miles wide, and the shipping lanes through it are even narrower than that. Roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil consumption passes through that strait on tankers every single day, along with a large share of global liquefied natural gas shipments. There is no realistic alternate route for most of that traffic. So when Iran declares the strait closed, or when tankers start getting attacked inside it, that's not a regional story, that's a global economic story because it directly threatens the flow of energy that a huge portion of the world depends on. That's exactly why you saw oil prices spike the way they did the moment Iran hit those tankers and the US said it would reinstate its blockade. It's also why countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and others in that region have been pulled into this conflict even though the core dispute is between the US and Iran because their ports, their tankers, and in some cases their own military bases hosting U.S. forces sit right in the blast radius of this thing geographically and economically. I also want to spend a minute on something that I think gets lost in a lot of the coverage, which is just how fluid and how fast-moving this specific situation is. In the span of about 1 week, we went from a fragile ceasefire to missile exchanges with 6 different countries in a single night, to the closure of one of the most important waterways on the planet, to a naval blockade being reinstated, to oil markets swinging by nearly 10% in a day. That is an extraordinarily compressed timeline for events of this magnitude, and it tells you that whatever stability existed under that Memorandum of Understanding, signed back in June, was thinner than it looked. Diplomats from Oman, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan have all been in contact trying to help mediate and de-escalate, and Pakistan in particular has served as a key channel between Washington and Tehran throughout this. Whether that diplomatic track can catch up to the pace of the military escalation is honestly an open question right now, and I don't think anyone, including people far more plugged in than me, can tell you with confidence how the next week plays out. So here's my read on all of this, for what it's worth, coming at it from a pure operations and air power background rather than a political one, because that's genuinely not my lane, and I want to stay in my lane here. What strikes me most is the tempo. 4 rounds of significant U.S. strikes in about a week, and Iranian retaliation against 6 countries in a single night is an extremely high operational tempo to sustain. Militaries generally can't keep that pace up indefinitely without either running through munitions, stockpiles faster than they can be replenished, or without accepting a rising risk of a mistake, a misidentified target, an interceptor failure, a miscommunication that pushes things past a point where anyone intended them to go. The use of sea-based one-way drones for the first time also tells me planners are looking for ways to keep hitting targets while managing the risk to their own people and their own aircraft, which is exactly what you'd expect a rational military to do the longer a conflict like this drags on. And the fact that a brand new, largely unknown supreme leader is now the one making decisions on Iran's side adds a genuine wild card to how this next stretch unfolds, simply because there isn't the same track record to lean on that there was with his predecessor. I'd also point out something from a strike planning perspective that I think explains why we keep seeing this cycle repeat itself. Every time you see a round of US strikes described as being in direct response to a specific Iranian action, like the tanker attacks in the Strait, and then Iranian retaliation described as being in response to that round of US strikes, you're watching what planners call an escalation ladder, where each side is trying to respond proportionally, or in some cases more than proportionally, to avoid looking weak, while also trying not to trigger the kind of response that pulls in outside powers or crosses a line that makes de-escalation impossible. The risk with an escalation ladder like this one is that it only takes a single miscalculation, an interceptor that fails at the wrong moment, a strike that hits something more sensitive than intended, a communication that gets misread, to jump several rungs at once. That's really the core danger here, not any single night's target list, but the cumulative momentum of 4 rounds of strikes and multiple rounds of retaliation in the span of about a week, with mediators from multiple countries working hard just to keep a diplomatic track alive in parallel. I'll also give you a bit of a perspective from the airline side of my career, because this kind of spike in oil prices doesn't just show up at the gas pump, it ripples straight through commercial aviation too. Jet fuel prices track pretty closely with crude oil, and when Brent jumps 9.5% in a single day like it did this week, airlines feel that almost immediately, because fuel is one of the single largest line items in any airline's operating budget, often rivaling labor costs. When prices spike like this, you'll typically see airlines respond with fuel surcharges on tickets, adjustments to routing to save fuel burn where possible, and in some cases, carriers will actually reroute flights away from airspace near an active conflict zone entirely, which adds flight time, adds fuel burn, and adds cost on top of the baseline price spike. It's also worth mentioning that multiple airlines have already had to suspend or adjust routes through parts of Gulf airspace during earlier phases of this conflict, given the obvious risk of operating anywhere near live missile and drone activity, even if that activity is meant to be aimed at specific military targets. Stray debris, misidentified aircraft, and GPS interference near an active conflict zone are all real risks that commercial carriers have to weigh. And I can tell you from firsthand experience flying internationally, dispatchers and operation centers take these kinds of advisories extremely seriously and will reroute a flight hundreds of miles out of the way rather than take on that risk. I also want to mention where things stood diplomatically as of this week, because despite everything I just walked you through, the diplomatic track hasn't completely collapsed. Iran's foreign minister has been in direct contact with counterparts in Oman, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, and has also spoken with Pakistan's top military official, who has served as one of the key go-betweens connecting Washington and Tehran throughout this entire process. Oman, in particular, has continued hosting discussions specifically focused on shipping and management of the Strait of Hormuz, even while attacks tied to Iran were being reported inside Omani waters and against Omani territory in the same general window. That tells you the back-channel diplomacy hasn't shut down, even as the shooting has intensified, which is actually a somewhat encouraging sign, because historically, wars that tend to end through exactly this kind of parallel track. Quiet diplomatic contact, continuing even while the military situation looks its worst on the surface. I want to be really clear about one more thing before I wrap up, and it's important to me that you hear this part. Everything I just walked you through is based on reporting that's been confirmed through multiple outlets, and where possible, through official statements from CENTCOM, from Jordanian, Kuwaiti, Omani, Emirati, and Bahraini officials, and from Iranian state media, with the specific caveat I flagged earlier about that one incident where the attribution was disputed. Anything that's still just a claim from one side without independent confirmation, I've tried to label as a claim rather than a fact. This story is moving in real time, so by the time you're watching this, there's a good chance something has already shifted. Another round of strikes, another attempt at a ceasefire, another development out of Tehran. So please don't treat this video as the final word. Treat it as a solid, verified snapshot of where things stood as of this week, and go check reliable, established outlets for anything that's happened since. Look, I know a video like this can feel heavy. We're talking about strikes, interceptors, tankers, blockades, and unfortunately, real casualties on the ground. But I'd rather give you the full, honest, sourced picture than a sanitized version or an exaggerated one. That's always been the goal on this channel, whether I'm breaking down a plane crash, a rescue operation, or something like this. Give you the facts as they're actually confirmed, flag clearly what's still unverified, and then give you my honest read as someone with real operational background, not just an opinion pulled out of thin air. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, cutting through the noise and giving you the actual operational picture instead of just headlines and hot takes, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I'm going to keep tracking this story as it develops, and I don't want you to miss the next update when there's real confirmed movement to report on. And second, drop a comment below and let me know what part of this you want me to go deeper on next time. whether that's the missile defense side of things, the economics of the Strait of Hormuz, or the broader military picture across the region, because your comments genuinely shape what I dig into next on this channel. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, signing off. Stay safe out there, everybody. Keep an eye on verified reporting as this story keeps developing over the coming days, and I'll see you in the next one.